This portrait hangs in Madrid. It was commissioned to prove that the dynasty was healthy. The painter softened the jaw, shortened the lower lip, and gave the eyes a light they did not have. He could not remove the mouth that would not close. The boy in the frame is Charles II of Spain, master of an empire that reached from Naples to Manila, and he could not chew his own food. Servants cut it for him. He did not speak a word until he was 4 years old. He was carried, not walked, until he was 10. On the 18th day of November, 1700, 5 physicians opened his body in a room in the Alcazar, and what they wrote down has never stopped being read. They found entrails that had rotted. They found 1 testicle, black. They found a skull filled with water, and they found a heart they described as the size of a peppercorn. The portrait tells one story. The bones tell another. This is where that body came from, what it did to the man carrying it, and what it cost a continent. Look at the lower half of that face again. The condition has a clinical name, mandibular prognathism, a lower jaw that grows forward past the upper one. Europe gave it a simpler name and used it for 2 centuries. They called it the Habsburg jaw, and they said it the way you say a family crest. In Charles, it reached the furthest point ever recorded in the line. His upper and lower teeth did not meet at any point. A man who cannot bring his teeth together cannot grind food, and a man who cannot grind food swallows it whole, or does not eat. So the royal kitchen adapted. Meat arrived at his table already reduced to pieces small enough to go down without chewing. His tongue was described as too large for his mouth, which thickened his speech until foreign visitors claimed they could not understand him even when he spoke their language. Ambassadors wrote about the saliva. They wrote about it in official dispatches to their governments, alongside troop numbers and harvest reports. One of those dispatches would later be used to justify a war, though nobody reading it in the 1670s knew that yet. Here is the part most people never hear. That jaw was not a misfortune that fell on this family from outside. It was manufactured, patiently, across roughly 200 years, by people who knew exactly what they were doing with the marriage contracts and did it anyway. The reason they kept doing it is the single strangest thing in this story, and it was written down in plain language by the men who arranged it. Go back to the beginning of the habit. The Habsburgs held more territory than any European family had ever held, spread across 2 branches, one in Madrid, one in Vienna. Territory could be lost by war. It could also be lost by marriage, because a daughter married outside the family carried claims out of the house with her. So the family solved the problem the way an accountant solves a leak. They married their children to each other. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece. First cousins once removed, then first cousins again, then closer. Every generation the same instrument, applied again. The church forbade marriage between close relations. The church also granted exceptions, and it granted them to this family more readily than to any other in Europe. A dispensation was requested, argued, paid for, and issued. Then the wedding proceeded, legally, publicly, with the blessing of Rome, and the family tree folded in on itself once more. Which brings us to the marriage that produced the man in the portrait. In 1649, Philip IV of Spain married Mariana of Austria. She was his sister's daughter. He was her mother's brother. She was 14 when the arrangement was settled. He was 44, and he had been intended as her father-in-law, not her husband, because she had originally been promised to his son. That son died first. The bride had already been shipped west. Rather than send her home, the family reassigned her one step up the tree to the widowed uncle himself. Read that again slowly, because the arithmetic matters later. A man married the daughter of his own sister, with permission, in a cathedral, to protect an inheritance. The contract was thick, careful, and entirely lawful. It is one of the most consequential documents of the 17th century, and not one line of it mentions a child's health. What followed was a decade of small coffins. Mariana gave birth again and again. A daughter, Margarita Teresa, survived. The rest did not. Infants who lived days, children who lived months. A son named Philippe Prospero, on whom the whole succession rested, was born frail and stayed frail, swollen, seizing, watched hourly by physicians who could do nothing but bleed him. He died in the first days of November, 1661. The court began arranging the funeral of the only male heir to the largest empire on earth. 5 days later, the Queen went into labor. Picture that room. Madrid, the 6th day of November, 1661, in the Alcazar Palace, where the air was thick with candle smoke and the burnt resin smell of the braziers they kept lit against the autumn cold. The mother had buried 5 children already, and the 6th had been in the ground less than a week. Outside the door stood physicians, confessors, the papal nuncio, and men whose entire political future depended on what sex the child was. Inside, a woman of 27 was delivering the last chance of a dynasty. She had done this before. She had lost every time but once. The child was a boy. The relief lasted perhaps an hour, because then the physicians examined him, and their notes are careful, and their care is the frightening part. The head was recorded as unusually large. The mouth would not close. The infant was weak, and the weakness did not pass after the first days as newborn weakness usually does. There is a report that he was given to a wet nurse immediately and that he fed badly from the start. The father was told, in the language physicians used when they wanted to protect themselves, that the prince's constitution was delicate and that the coming year would decide the matter. Philip IV had waited a decade for this son. He was informed, within days of the birth, that the boy would probably not live to see his first winter end. That is a fear most people alive today have never had to hold. A parent waiting to learn whether a newborn will survive the month, with nothing to do but wait and be told nothing useful. The difference here is only scale. In that room, the private terror of one family was also the strategic problem of every government in Europe, and there was no privacy in it at all. Ambassadors were already writing home about the shape of the baby's mouth. He was baptized Carlos. History would know him as Charles II, and he would outlive every prediction made over his cradle by 38 years. The men who kept him alive were not the physicians. They were the wet nurses. 14 of them passed through his household in the first years, one after another, because the child fed poorly, and each nurse was blamed and replaced when he failed to thrive. He was still being nursed at an age when other royal children were being taught letters. The court kept the last of those women on the payroll long past every custom, because she was the only person who could reliably get food into him. A great deal of Spanish state expenditure in the 1660s went on soft food, warm rooms, and the wages of women hired to feed a child who could not chew. He did not walk. He did not speak. Grandees who came to see the heir to Naples, Sicily, Milan, Flanders, Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines were shown a silent boy carried in the arms of a servant. Some of them knelt. All of them wrote letters afterwards. And the court physicians wrote too. Their reports from those years survive, and they are cautious documents, hedged with the medical vocabulary of the age: humors, vapors, corrupted airs, the moon. But underneath the hedging, one word begins to appear. It is not a medical word. It is a judgment, and it was applied to a child who had not yet had the chance to say a single sentence. Once it entered the dispatches, it never left them. It traveled to Paris, to Vienna, to Venice, to London. It shaped how every chancellery in Europe planned for the next 40 years. It is still the first thing most people are told about him today. That word was written down before he could speak, and the man who eventually did speak, who read state papers, remembered his servants by name, and made one decision that set 5 armies marching, spent his whole life inside it. The word is coming. So is the reason the family could never admit where the jaw came from. The word was debilidad, weakness, and in the mouths of the men who ran Spain, it stopped being a medical description and became a permanent administrative category. Once a court accepts that a child is incapable, everything else follows logically, and everything that follows makes the incapacity worse. Start with the nursery, because the nursery is where the decisions were made. The boy was not allowed on stairs. He was not taken outdoors in cold weather, or in hot weather, or in wind, because the physicians had decided his constitution could not survive a change of air. He was not given lessons at the age other royal children began them, on the reasoning that mental effort drained the vital spirits, and he had none to spare. So a child with weak legs was kept from walking, and a child with delayed speech was kept from being taught to speak. And the men who arranged all this then recorded with concern that the prince did not walk or speak. The wet nurse stayed. Custom said a royal child left the breast at 2 years, perhaps 3. Charles was still being nursed at 4, and by some accounts, closer to 5, and the woman feeding him was paid a salary that outstripped what a Castilian officer earned in the field. 14 nurses had already been used up and dismissed. The last of them held a position at court that no servant of her rank had ever held, for the simplest reason in the world. She was the only person in the palace who could reliably get nourishment into the heir to the largest empire on earth. Every meal was a public act. Spanish court ritual required witnesses to the king's dining, and the ritual was not suspended for a child who could not chew. Attendants brought the dish. A servant cut the meat into pieces small enough to be swallowed whole. Grandees stood and watched, hats in hand, in silence while it was done. Nobody in that room was permitted to look away, and nobody was permitted to comment, and every single one of them wrote about it later. Consider what that arrangement did to a small boy, because this is the part of the story that has nothing to do with kings. He was the most closely watched child in Europe, and the least touched. He was shown, then removed, brought into a hall of standing men, held up so they could see he was alive, and carried out again before anyone could speak to him. A Venetian who attended one of these appearances noted that the child made no sound at all during the whole ceremony, and that no one addressed him. Anyone who has been in a room where adults discuss you in the third person, over your head, as a problem to be managed, knows exactly what that silence feels like. Charles lived inside that room for 11 years, and the doors of it were guarded by his own government. The dispatches are where the era speaks in its own voice, and its voice is worse than anything a narrator would dare invent. The French ambassador wrote home that the prince appeared extremely weak, and that his head was disproportionate, and predicted, in writing, to his own foreign minister, that he could not survive to adulthood. A Venetian report called him of the utmost fragility. The nuncio wrote of a mouth that hung open and legs that would not bear weight. The imperial envoy, representing the boy's own relatives in Vienna, reported that the child seemed insensible to what happened around him. Every chancellery in Europe kept a file. Not one of those files considered the possibility that the child was intelligent and simply had nobody speaking to him. Then, on the 17th day of September, 1665, Philip IV died, and a boy who was 3 years old became King of Spain, King of Naples and Sicily, Duke of Milan, Lord of the Netherlands, and sovereign of every Spanish possession in America and Asia. He could not read. He could not stand for the length of a ceremony. He was carried to his own proclamation. And here is the thing that decided the next 35 years. The regency was not built as a temporary bridge to a king who would take power at his majority. It was built on the assumption that Charles would never rule at all. His mother, Mariana, became regent, a queen mother governing on behalf of a son she had been told repeatedly would not live. And around her a machine assembled itself that took power for granted as its own. Nobody drafted a plan for handing the empire to Charles, because nobody drafting believed there would be a Charles to hand it to. That single assumption is the hinge of his entire life, and if it has landed for you, tap the thumbs up. It tells the algorithm this story is worth showing to the next person, and we keep going. Because the machine got to work immediately. Mariana's confessor, an Austrian Jesuit named Nithard, was elevated from a priest with no Spanish standing to Inquisitor General and the effective First Minister of the monarchy. He was hated on sight, a foreigner running Castile through a foreign queen, and he lasted 4 years before the grandees forced him out of the country. Then came Fernando de Valenzuela, a minor nobleman who rose through the queen's household and was mocked across Europe as the palace ghost, because he moved through the corridors carrying decisions nobody could trace. And behind both of them stood Don Juan José of Austria, the late king's illegitimate son, a soldier with an army, a following, and a permanent grievance. 3 men, one after another, fighting over the machinery of a world empire. Not one of them was the king. Power flowed around the boy the way water flows around a stone in a stream, and everyone at court learned early that the way to get anything done in Spain was to go past Charles, never through him. Meanwhile, the medicine continued. He was bled regularly from the arm and from the feet by physicians who believed his sluggishness was corrupt blood that could be drained out of him. He was purged. He was given powders of ground pearl, of bezoar stone, of dried animal parts, prepared by the royal apothecary and administered on schedule. Relics were laid on his body, the bones of saints brought from monasteries and pressed against a child's chest while prayers were read over him. Every one of these treatments weakened a boy the doctors were trying to strengthen, and the weaker he became, the more of them they applied. The tutor's reports closed the circle. Reading was introduced late and taught thinly. Latin, the working language of European diplomacy, was neglected almost entirely, which meant that when Charles eventually sat in council, he faced documents in a language he had never been properly given. Statecraft, finance, the administration of the Indies, the subjects a king needs, were deferred, then deferred again, on the standing advice that instruction would exhaust him. One tutor's assessment survives in summary, and it amounts to a shrug. The prince, it says, applies himself as far as his condition allows. Look at who wrote that verdict. The council that signed off on his education was made up of the same families and the same offices that had negotiated the dispensation for his parents' marriage. The men who arranged for an uncle to marry his niece were the men who then diagnosed the result as incurable and governed in his place for 11 years. They built the condition, then cited it as grounds for keeping the crown out of his hands. So here is where we stand. A boy manufactured by 2 centuries of marriage contracts, born into a room full of men predicting his death, crowned at 3, written off in 4 languages, and governed around rather than through. Every document from those years agrees he was incapable. And nobody has ever been able to explain what happened next. Because at 14, this boy who could not read Latin walked into a council chamber, dismissed the man running Spain, and signed the order himself. The regency ended in a way nobody at court had planned for, and what the king did with his first act of power was the strangest thing in this entire story. He signed that order at 14, and the men who had governed for him spent the next 25 years explaining why it did not count. To understand why they could dismiss a king in his own palace, you have to look at the document they never put in front of anyone. The family tree, laid flat. Draw it properly, and it stops looking like a tree. A tree branches outward. This one folds back on itself at every generation, the same names reappearing where new names should be. Across roughly 200 years, the Spanish Habsburgs contracted something close to 11 marriages inside their own extended family. Cousins married cousins. An uncle married his niece, twice in the direct line leading to Charles. Great-grandparents turn up as grandparents. Where a person should have had 64 distinct ancestors in the 6th generation back, Charles had a fraction of that number, because the same individuals occupy several positions at once. In 2009, a team of Spanish geneticists reconstructed that pedigree across 16 generations and calculated what it produced. The inbreeding coefficient they arrived at for Charles was roughly 0.254. That figure means about 1/4 of his genome came to him in duplicate from a shared ancestor. A child born to a brother and sister sits near 0.25. Charles sat at or above it, the highest recorded value in the entire dynasty, produced not by a single transgression, but by patient administrative work over 2 centuries. The dispensations tell you it was never accidental. Marriage between close kin was forbidden by canon law, and each of these unions needed the Pope's written permission to proceed. Applications were drafted. Arguments were made about dynastic necessity and the defense of the faith. Money and diplomatic pressure moved. Then a document arrived from Rome, and the wedding went ahead in a cathedral with the full approval of the church. Warnings existed, and that is the detail most tellings leave out. Physicians and courtiers had noticed, generations earlier, that the children of these marriages died young with unusual regularity. The jaw itself was visible in portraits going back to Maximilian I, worsening steadily down the line, and nobody who looked at those paintings side by side could have failed to see the trend. Ambassadors joked about it in private correspondence. Spanish nobles avoided such matches within their own houses, which means the practice was understood well enough to be avoided by people with less to lose. The family kept going anyway, because the alternative was letting a claim to Milan or the Netherlands walk out of the house on a bride. Now consider what that means for the man in the portrait, because this is where the story turns from medicine into something harder. Every limitation he had was arranged before he was conceived, by people who then treated it as his personal failing. The council that shrugged at his slow reading contained the descendants of the men who had drafted the dispensation. His mother, who had been informed her son might not live the year, was the product of the same practice, and had been placed in that marriage at 14 without being consulted. Nobody involved was ever held accountable for a decision that cost a child a functioning body, and everybody involved profited from the empire those marriages preserved. That is a shape most people recognize from smaller lives. The ones who set the conditions are never the ones who live in them, and they are usually the loudest about how badly you are coping. Charles carried the consequences of 11 weddings he had no part in, and he was blamed for the result from the day he was born. Then came the part that no one at the time was willing to say out loud, and the part the family found a way to avoid saying for the rest of his life. He married twice. Marie-Louise of Orléans arrived in 1679, a French princess of 19, and produced no child in 10 years of marriage. She died in 1689. Maria Anna of Neuburg came next, chosen deliberately from a family famous for fertility, and produced no child either. By the 1690s, the succession of the Spanish Empire had become the most urgent, unresolved question in European politics, and the reason was one man's body. The court had a choice of explanations. One was sitting in the family archive in the form of 11 marriage contracts and a jaw that had been getting worse in portraits for 200 years. The other required no self-examination at all. They chose sorcery. The king, it was decided, was hechizado, bewitched. Someone had worked magic on his body to make him barren, and if the spell could be found and broken, the empire would have its heir. This was not a rumor circulating among peasants. It was the working position of confessors at the highest level of the Spanish Church, and it was acted upon by the Inquisition, the same institution whose officers had spent 2 centuries processing the paperwork that made those marriages lawful. Froilan Diaz, the king's own confessor and a man of considerable standing, took the theory seriously enough to pursue it through channels. Nuns in a convent at Cangas were said to be possessed, and possessed nuns were understood to be able to answer questions put to the demons speaking through them. Inquiries were sent. Answers came back, obtained through interrogation of women in a state no modern reader would describe as voluntary, and those answers named the source of the spell. Picture the room where the remedy was applied. A grown man, king of half the world, laid out while priests read the Roman ritual of exorcism over him. Holy oil, relics against the skin, the formula demanding that the spirit declare its name and depart. Charles submitted to it more than once, because his own churchmen told him a demon was the reason he had no son. The king is bewitched, and the spell lies in his chocolate. That is close to how one line of the accusation actually ran, and the court investigated it with the seriousness other governments reserve for invasion. A rival faction accused the Queen's household of the witchcraft. The Queen's household accused the confessor. Diaz was eventually arrested and removed by the Inquisitor General he had crossed, which tells you what the exorcisms were really for. The demons were a weapon in a court fight over who would control a dying king. Modern medicine has offered its own reading, and honesty requires calling it a reading rather than a verdict. The most cited proposal, from the same Spanish research group, is that Charles suffered 2 distinct inherited disorders at once: combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would account for his short stature, his weakness, his infertility, and his sluggishness, together with distal renal tubular acidosis, which would account for the blood in his urine, the swelling, the loose teeth, and the recurring digestive collapse. 2 rare recessive conditions in one man is statistically almost impossible in an ordinary family. In a genome that is 1/4 duplicated, it becomes plausible. Other researchers disagree, and their objection is fair. No tissue has been tested, no genome has been sequenced. Every diagnosis rests on portraits, on court gossip, and on the descriptions of physicians who believed illness came from corrupted humors. The debate is genuinely open, and anyone who tells you the case is closed is telling you more than the evidence allows. What is not in dispute is what the archive at Simancas holds: the contracts, the dispensations, the physician's reports, the exorcism files. Every document explaining how the body was made, and every document pretending the body was cursed, filed a few shelves apart. there was one more document to come, and it concerned neither his blood nor his demons. It was about who would take the empire when he let go of it. It would be signed by a hand that could barely hold a pen, and it had not been written yet. When it was, it set 5 armies marching across Europe. But the strangest part is who the dying king chose, and why nobody, then or since, expected that name. Before we get to that name, one thing worth putting in the comments. A family with the best physicians in Europe, the best archives, and every portrait on the wall showing the jaw getting worse. Write down what you think they actually knew and chose not to say. Read a few of the replies too, because the disagreement there is genuinely interesting. Now go back to 1675, when the regency ended in a way nobody at court had prepared for. Charles turned 14, which by the terms of his father's will made him king in his own right. Valenzuela expected the arrangement to continue on paper only. Instead, the boy signed the papers dissolving his mother's authority, and within 2 years Valenzuela was stripped of everything and shipped to the Philippines, the furthest posting the Spanish Empire could offer a man. The council recorded the act and then behaved as though it had not happened. Don Juan José of Austria took the government, died within 2 years, and the machinery closed over the king again. Charles had proved he could act. Nobody adjusted a single assumption about him. What they did instead was marry him. In 1679, a marriage was arranged with Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of Louis XIV, aged 17, and she did not want to go. She wept at Fontainebleau. Her uncle told her that as Queen of Spain she would be the first princess of Europe, and she answered that she would rather remain the last in France. She was sent anyway, in a cortege that took months, and when she reached Burgos and saw her husband for the first time, she was not permitted a private moment before the ceremony. Their marriage was, by every surviving account, affectionate. He was devoted to her. He gave her the parrots and the small dogs she liked, tolerated her French manners against the fury of his own court, and defended her when the etiquette police of the Alcazar reported her for riding horses. And her household was searched, her correspondence read, and her body treated as public property from the first month. The court measured her cycle. Physicians and ladies of the bedchamber were required to report monthly whether the queen showed signs of pregnancy, and those reports went to the council and from the council to the ambassadors. Every failure was logged. Every logged failure produced a new remedy: pilgrimages, novenas, waters, mineral cures, changes of diet imposed on a 19-year-old by men who never once considered examining the king. Picture her room in the winter of 1689. She had been ill for days, vomiting, in violent abdominal pain, unable to keep anything down. Outside the door stood the physicians, and inside the room stood women who had been instructed for 10 years to report on her body to the state. She was 26. She had been in Spain for 10 years and had produced nothing the court considered a result, and she knew precisely what was being said of her in Paris and in Vienna. "They will say I have been poisoned." That is close to what she is reported to have said as she was dying, and the rumor began before she was cold. Charles wept openly, which the Spanish court found undignified in a king. Modern reading of the symptoms suggests appendicitis or a burst abdominal condition. Nobody at the time suggested that 10 years of blame might have had a cost. The pressure did not pause for mourning. Within months, the search for a second wife was underway, and the criterion was explicit. Maria Anna of Neuburg came from a German family celebrated across Europe for producing children in quantity. Her sisters had filled thrones with heirs. She arrived in 1690 with an entourage, a confessor, and an assumption that fertile stock would settle the question. It settled nothing. 9 more years passed without a pregnancy, and the blame moved with the same logic it had used before. First, the dead French queen had been at fault. Now the German queen was at fault, or the German queen's household, or a spell placed by someone in the German queen's household. The one explanation nobody was allowed to state officially was the one every physician who had ever examined the king could have written in a sentence. Meanwhile, the treatments intensified because the court's response to failure was always volume. He was bled from the arms, from the ankles, from behind the ears, on a schedule, by men who believed his lethargy was thick blood that could be let out of him. He was purged with antimony and with senna until he could not stand. He was given powdered emerald, ground pearl, bezoar stone, and a preparation made from the dried flesh of a bird, all charged to the royal apothecary and all recorded in the household accounts. He was made to drink the milk of a woman brought to court for that purpose, in his 30s, because a physician had proposed that human milk restored the vital spirits. Relics were laid on him constantly. The bones of saints traveled from monasteries across Castile to be pressed against a grown man's chest while prayers were read. Warm animal carcasses were opened and applied to his abdomen for heat. Pigeons were split and bound to his head. These were not the treatments of a village healer. They were prescribed by the Royal Proto-Medico, the highest medical office in the Spanish monarchy. Then there was the day at the Escorial, and it is the point where the handling of him stops resembling medicine at all. Charles ordered, or was persuaded to order, the opening of the royal tombs. The coffins of his ancestors were unsealed, and he was brought down to look at them. He stood in the vault and had the remains of Charles V shown to him, and the body of his own father, and the body of his first wife, Marie Louise, who had been dead for years. Witnesses recorded that he looked at her for a long time and said that she was still beautiful. Some accounts say he went to gain strength from the presence of his forebears. Others say his confessors encouraged it as a preparation for death. Both readings agree on the essential fact: the King of Spain was taken into a crypt to view corpses as a therapeutic measure, and the men who arranged it wrote it up as care. While that was being done to him, the empire around him thinned out. The treasury defaulted repeatedly. Coinage was debased, and then debased again, wiping out savings across Castile. Tax revenue from the Indies fell, garrisons went unpaid, and provinces were governed by men who had bought the office. Plague and famine cut through Andalusia and Catalonia in the 1680s, and the population of Spain fell in absolute terms during his reign, the only such collapse in early modern Spanish history. And the ambassadors kept writing. Their dispatches from Madrid in the 1690s read like military intelligence, because that is exactly what they were. The French envoy reported on how much the king ate at dinner, whether he had walked that week, the color of his face, whether he had been carried to Mass or had gone on his own feet. Vienna wanted to know about his cough. Venice reported on his sleep. London filed on his teeth. Every chancellery in Europe maintained a running estimate of how long one man's body would hold, and armies were budgeted against that estimate. 17 million people lived under his crown, and their fate turned on whether he could keep food down that month. The kings of France and the emperor in Vienna were already dividing his possessions on paper, in secret treaties signed while he was still alive, still reading his own correspondence, still signing his own name. And Charles knew about those treaties. He had read them. What he did in the last year of his life, in full knowledge that Europe had already carved him up, is the part of this story nobody sees coming.
His family sacrificed their children for 2 centuries so as not to lose land, and then all together blamed him for the consequences. And it was convenient for them. As long as he is helpless, they rule instead of him. And then he learns that France and Austria have already divided his empire among themselves. If I were him, I would be furious, because this is the moment when you realize that you have been used all your life. Write in the comments, how would you behave?
Set the ambassador's dispatches aside for a moment and open the other file, the one made of his own handwriting. It exists, and it is larger than most people assume. Charles II signed thousands of documents across 35 years, and his signature is there on consultas, on appointments, on grants, on orders to the Indies. The hand is labored, and it deteriorates visibly across the decades. It never stops appearing. A king who was described in 4 languages as insensible to his surroundings put his own name to the business of a world empire, week after week, for a lifetime. He also insisted on hearing things himself. The practice at court had been to summarize for him, briefly, and let him assent. Charles broke that habit repeatedly, requiring papers to be read to him in full and asking for the parts he had not followed to be read again. Secretaries complained about the time it took. A minister who wanted a quick signature learned to expect questions instead, and the most reliable way to be refused by this king was to hand him something he had not had explained. The household accounts show the rest of the man, and they show him more honestly than any dispatch. He kept servants by name for decades. He paid pensions to people who could no longer work for him, including women from his nursery years. He had dogs, hunting dogs he knew individually, and expenses recorded for their feed, their kennels, their treatment when they were injured. He hunted whenever his body allowed it, which was less and less often, and he arranged to be carried to the hunt when he could no longer ride to it. Music mattered to him. The court accounts record payments for instruments, for singers, for the theater performances he attended in his own apartments when he could not sit through a public one. He read, slowly, and he collected. He was generous to the point of imprudence with people around him, and his ministers noted it as a fault, because a king who cannot say no to a petitioner is a problem for a treasury already in default. His affection for both wives is documented past any doubt. Marie-Louise's death broke something in him that the court found embarrassing in a monarch. With Maria Anna, the marriage was harder, and she was accused by half of Madrid of governing him. Yet he protected her circle, kept her German attendants on the payroll against sustained pressure to dismiss them, and defended people whose only value to him was that they were hers. The hardest thing in the record is that he knew. He knew what his body was, and he knew there would be no son. Confessors' notes and ambassadorial reports both describe a man who spoke about the end of his line without illusion, who understood that he was the last of his house, and who kept working anyway. A great many people in that position stop caring what happens after them. He did the opposite. Which brings us to the sessions that decided Europe, and to the one thing Charles cared about more than his own name. By 1698, the powers had run out of patience with waiting for him to die. Louis XIV of France and William III of England signed a partition treaty dividing the Spanish monarchy between claimants. Spain and the Indies to one, Milan and Naples and Sicily distributed among others. A second partition treaty followed in 1700, adjusting the shares. Neither treaty was shown to the King of Spain. Both concerned every acre he ruled, and both were negotiated over a living man as though the paperwork of his estate could begin early. Charles found out. Copies reached Madrid, and he read them, and the reaction of a man supposedly incapable of understanding state business was immediate and precise. He grasped the single point that mattered. His crown could go to a Frenchman or to an Austrian, and Spain would survive either. It could not be cut into pieces and survive at all. So the last 2 years of his reign became the only sustained political campaign of his life. He summoned the Council of State again and again. He demanded opinions in writing. He required the arguments to be laid out in language he could follow, and when a counselor gave him a formula instead of a reason, he sent him back to produce the reason. He consulted the Council of Castile. He wrote to the Pope for an opinion, and received one. The most closely watched invalid in Europe ran a 2-year deliberation on the future of a quarter of the known world. The pressure on him in those rooms was enormous. His own wife wanted the Austrian candidate because she was Austrian. His mother's family in Vienna had been counting on the Habsburg claim for a century. Half his court had been paid by one side or the other. Every argument put to him came attached to somebody's interest, and he knew it. And he kept asking the same question underneath all of them. Here is the scene, and where the record does not preserve his exact words, this is how it could have sounded. Autumn of 1700. A table in the Buen Retiro. The draft of the testament in front of him. 2 secretaries and a confessor standing. He could no longer walk unaided. His hands shook badly enough that writing took several attempts. He listened to the clause naming the heir read out twice, and then he asked the only thing he wanted to know. And under this, the monarchy stays whole, not one province given away. He was assured that it did. Then read it to me again from the beginning. Consider what that requires from a person. He was 38, dying, childless, in constant pain, being lobbied by his wife, his relatives, and 2 great powers, and every man in the room had a private stake in his answer. He had been told since infancy that he could not understand documents. He sat there and made them read it twice. Anybody who has ever been underestimated their entire life knows what it costs to keep asking the question when everyone in the room is waiting for you to simply agree. And he did it on the largest matter any European had decided in a century. That table is the moment the man steps out from behind the portrait. On the 2nd day of October, 1700, Charles II signed his testament. He named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, universal heir to the entire undivided Spanish monarchy. Look at what that choice actually was. He gave his empire to the grandson of the king who had made war on Spain for most of his reign, who had taken Spanish territory by force, and whose army had burned through Flanders and Catalonia. He gave it away from his own dynasty, away from Vienna, away from the family that had built his body out of 11 marriages. And he did it because the French candidate was the only one strong enough to hold the monarchy together in one piece, and because both partition treaties had been signed by the Austrians' partners as readily as by the French. There was a condition, and it shows the same mind at work. The testament required that the crowns of France and Spain never be united in one person. He was handing the empire to a Bourbon while forbidding France from absorbing it. That clause was not sentiment. It was the most sophisticated single provision in 17th century Spanish statecraft, produced by the king every chancellery in Europe had written off before he could speak. The last weeks were brutal. He could not keep food down at all. His legs and abdomen swelled, his teeth had gone, his eyesight was failing, and he had seizures that left him unresponsive for hours. He was bled again and purged again, and the relics came out again. The proto-medico's notes describe a body shutting down system by system across October of 1700. His mind did not go with it. Witnesses in those rooms recorded a man still asking after documents. He wanted to know whether the testament had been properly deposited. He asked about the ceiling. He gave instructions about his household, about pensions, about specific servants, about who was to be provided for after he was gone. He was arranging small mercies for people with no claim on him, while an empire waited outside the door for his heart to stop. The court had spent 39 years explaining that this man comprehended nothing. In his final year, he read 2 secret treaties, out-argued his own counsel, defied his family, and set the succession of the largest empire on earth, the single most consequential decision made by any European that century. He died on the 1st day of November, 1700, 4 days short of his 39th birthday. What happened in the following 17 days is the part almost nobody knows. 5 physicians with knives, and a continent that read their report as a starting gun. He died in Madrid on the 1st day of November, 1700, in the early afternoon. He was 38 years old, 1 month short of 39. The confessors were with him. The Queen had been sent from the room, and his last recorded concern was for the disposition of his papers. The bells of Madrid rang for a king whose subjects had been told for 35 years that he was already as good as dead. The next day, 5 physicians opened his body. They worked in a room in the palace with witnesses present, because a royal autopsy in Spain was a legal act as much as a medical one. Their report was copied, circulated, and read in every capital in Europe within weeks. It is the most quoted post-mortem in early modern history, and almost nobody who quotes it mentions that the men holding the knives were the same men who had bled him for decades. They opened the abdomen first. The entrails, they wrote, were corrupted, the intestines and the tissue around them putrefied, in a state they described as far advanced. The stomach was noted as abnormal. A man who had been unable to keep food down for years turned out to have a digestive tract that had been failing him physically, not spiritually, and no amount of purging had addressed any of it. They found a single testicle, and they recorded it as black. The other was absent or vestigial. 2 queens had been blamed for a decade each, examined monthly, prayed over, dosed, sent on pilgrimages, and accused of witchcraft. The answer had been in his own body from birth, and it took 1 hour with a blade to find it. They opened the skull. The cranium, the report says, was full of water. Fluid where brain tissue and structure should have been. The finding that has fed 3 centuries of argument about what he could and could not understand, and the finding that sits most awkwardly beside the 2 secret treaties he read and rejected. Then they reached the chest, and they wrote the line that outlived everything else about him. His heart, the physicians recorded, was the size of a peppercorn. Historians have argued about whether the phrase was literal measurement or the shocked shorthand of men describing something atrophied beyond their vocabulary. Either way, it went into the record, and from the record into the folklore, and it has been repeated ever since, as though it explained him. The word the court doctors first used over his cradle was weakness. What their successors found in that room was not weakness. It was a body assembled wrong before he drew a breath, and every institution that touched him for 38 years called the result a failing of the man. Then Europe went to war over it. Louis XIV accepted the testament for his grandson, who was proclaimed Philip V of Spain. England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria refused to accept it because a Bourbon in Madrid and a Bourbon in Versailles altered the balance of the continent beyond tolerance. The War of the Spanish Succession opened in 1701, and did not end until 1714. 13 years. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet, Almansa, Brihuega. Battles fought from Bavaria to Andalusia to the Caribbean, with somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 dead, by the most cautious estimates, and famine and requisition killing more in the countryside the armies crossed. Barcelona held out to the last and was stormed in 1714. Catalonia lost its institutions as punishment. Gibraltar was taken by an Anglo-Dutch force in 1704 and has never been returned. At Utrecht and at Rastatt, the empire Charles had spent his last 2 years trying to keep whole was cut apart anyway. The Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, Sardinia, Sicily, Minorca, and Gibraltar all stripped away, distributed among the powers who had negotiated the partition treaties he had refused to sign. That is the bitter arithmetic of his single greatest political act. He was right that only one strong claimant could hold the monarchy together. He was right that partition would destroy it. And he lost anyway, because the moment he stopped breathing, the treaties he had blocked came back with armies behind them and took more than the partition plans had ever proposed. One clause survived, and it was his. France and Spain were never united under one crown. The condition he insisted on, from a table in the Buen Retiro, with 2 secretaries waiting for him to just sign the thing, was written into the peace of Europe and held. The Bourbons still sit in Madrid today because of a document dictated by a dying man whose own council had spent his lifetime working around him. The Habsburgs in Spain ended with him. The line that had held Castile and Aragon since Charles V, that had ruled Naples and Milan and Mexico and Peru and Manila, that had married inside itself 11 times to keep every acre in the house, lost all of it in the space of 14 years. Because the strategy designed to prevent the loss of the inheritance produced a man who could not leave one. Medicine kept the file open. Charles II is the most cited historical case in the entire genetic literature on royal consanguinity, and he earned that position by being the clearest example anyone has ever found. His pedigree is complete across 16 generations. His symptoms are documented by professionals who wrote daily, and his autopsy survives. Researchers who study inbreeding depression in human populations still open with him. A man who was called incapable of learning became the single most instructive body in the history of his own condition. Now go back to the portrait in Madrid. The painter softened the jaw. He shortened the lip, lifted the light in the eyes, and produced an image commissioned to prove that a dynasty was healthy. Stand in front of it now, and the softening is the most honest thing in the frame, because it is the exact gesture the whole century made. The family that arranged the marriages, the churchmen who granted the dispensations and then diagnosed a demon, the physicians who bled him and signed the record, the ambassadors who counted his meals and filed on his teeth. Every one of them looked at that face and adjusted what they saw. Where the responsibility actually sits is a question the documents lay out and never answer. The contracts are in one archive, the exorcism files a few shelves along, and no one has ever agreed on which shelf the blame belongs to. What can be said is smaller and steadier. He was told he was nothing from the day he was born, by everyone with authority over him, in 4 languages, for 38 years, and in the last 2, he did the one thing none of them expected. He read the papers himself and made the decision alone. If you want more of these, the body's history filed under weakness and got wrong. The subscribe button is right there, and it costs you nothing. Because the blood ran out in Madrid, it did not run out in Vienna. The other branch of that family kept marrying, kept the same jaw in its portraits, and carried it into the 20th century. The Spanish Habsburgs ended. The Austrian ones were only beginning.
What struck me most was that he never believed what they told him about himself. Not really. They spent 38 years convincing him he was helpless, and in the 2 years left, he simply started reading the papers himself and stopped waiting for anyone's permission. He was dying, he was in pain, and half the room wanted him to fail, and he asked the question nobody expected him to ask, over and over, until he got an answer he could live with. I think what we're actually looking at is a man who was right the whole time about his own mind, and everyone around him was wrong. That takes a kind of strength most of us will never need, but if we did, I'm not sure we'd have it. So here's what I want to know. Do you think he would have done that if they hadn't spent his whole life telling him he was weak? Would he have been as careful, as deliberate, as determined to get it exactly right if he'd had the luxury of confidence? Write that one in the comments.